Hey, everybody.
Hey everyone, welcome to our live stream on the Žižek-Jordan Peterson debate on capitalism and happiness, debate of the century that took place last night. We're the Multiversity, new podcast in town, and this is going to be a very exciting discussion. So please welcome, join us, share with your friends, and okay. So I guess we can get started. So everyone watched the debate, the Peterson Zizek debate.
I watched it live.
Nice.
Watched it live.
Yeah,
So
I watched it.
so Jordan Peterson and Zizek, this was like an interesting thing because it was supposed to be a debate between like capitalism versus communism on happiness. And it turned into something kind of different from that.
Yeah, so it started out, Peterson gave his very, very clear, very precise case on why capitalism is better for, well-being and happiness. And then Zizek presented his case, which is about several completely different things, and it's hard to pin down about what it was about.
And they each got 25 minutes, I think, for their opening statement. And then they were supposed to have, kind of go back and forth, each of them getting a 10-minute slot to kind of rebut. And then they were supposed to do this Q&A section at the end of the debate where they would allow audience questions. So, so as Kurt said, they both made their opening statement. And then since Zizek didn't really try to argue against what Peterson said, he just kind of, as he had kind of hinted at before the debate, he was like, well, I'm not really preparing for this as a debate. Like, it's just going to be a discussion, and I'm just going to basically, state my position, and so that the audience, understands what my position is. So that's, yeah. So after the opening statements, the moderator was kind of just like, you guys seem to want to like talk to each other a lot and not necessarily have a debate. Let's just have like a kind of back and forth discussion. And so that's where it went.
Oh, I was going to say maybe we should give a little bit of an intro to these two people, like as philosophers, who they are and kind of what brought them together. So yeah, Jordan Peterson is a psychology professor at University of Toronto?
Yeah.
And he's gotten pretty famous over the past couple of years for sharing his lectures on YouTube about psychology, about kind of archetypes and like common Western mythology. But like in particular, he got famous for criticizing what he calls neo-Marxist postmodernism and basically politically correct influence in Canadian and American universities, and like how he thinks that this kind of political correctness is really harming academic culture and culture in general. Zizek is a Marxist philosopher, and they came together to debate Marxism, but like Zizek's a really unorthodox Marxist. Peterson called him a lateral thinker. I think that's a good description of Zizek. Like when you read Zizek's philosophy, he's not usually like laying out an argument point by point. He's kind of bringing up a lot of ideas and painting a picture. And he's very critical of capitalism and of ideology and of a lot of things about the world as it runs today. But he's also critical of political correctness. So it was two interesting perspectives to be brought together.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that immediately strikes the viewer upon watching, the beginning of the debate is that Zizek isn't a Marxist, or if he is, it's kind of hard to tell how. Peterson pointedly asked him this at one point in the debate. In what way are you a Marxist? You seem to reject everything that Marx says, and yet you still cling to this label. And then Zizek was like, Hegel, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, and I was confused. Maybe other people watching weren't confused, but I was confused as to what Zizek's position was and how he was a Marxist. And I think Peterson was confused too, which is why the the debate kind of turned out just being this discussion of kind of wherever Žižek wanted it to go.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily characterize the debate the way you're characterizing it. I think it's interesting to look at some of like the background to this debate and how it came about. Like Žižek wrote an article, I believe in the Independent about 6 months ago, where he was very critical of Jordan Peterson and accused him kind of being a conspiracy theorist, like, which is interesting because he basically accused Peterson of like in talking about postmodern neo-Marxism and promoting a conspiracy theory, which they kind of addressed during the debate, which was interesting. And so what happened was after that, Peterson invited Žižek he basically challenged him to a debate. And there was some back and forth around that where Žižek said he would do it. And then he said he didn't want to do it. And he agreed to do it in the end. And it's interesting because we were watching some videos about like, they were both, Peterson and Žižek were kind of approaching this in very different ways. Like Peterson was reading and preparing and studying, and Žižek was kind of like, I don't really want to address Peterson too much. I just kind of want to show the audience that there's a way to be anti-politically correct and also leftist. And I just like, I want it to be very structured and to have a moderator, and we're just going to address the audience for 30 minutes. Then we're going to address each other very briefly. Then we're going to take questions from the audience. So he was kind of going into it with this idea, like he didn't really want to be addressing Peterson too much or engaging with him too much. And I thought it was interesting over the course of the debate how the way I interpret it was it almost seemed like Peterson kind of won him over to a certain extent, because by the end there was a lot of back and forth between them to the point where there was almost no audience questions. Like most of the debate was them having a discussion. And I think at certain points there was definitely elements of debate, both on deeper points and on shallower points. So it was interesting just in terms of between the relationship between the two of them, how the debate developed.
And I'll actually offer a slightly different spin on how Peterson approached it, because when you talk about preparation, Peterson explicitly said in the beginning, I didn't bother going through Žižek's work because there's too much of it. And so what I did was I went through the Communist Manifesto, treated it like a logical structural argument, even though he acknowledged in speech that it was really a popular call to action. And then he goes apart trying to pick at arguments that Žižek wasn't necessarily staking, or that even Karl Marx wasn't necessarily staking as much in his economic analysis for other things. Like Žižek was pointing out that he has a lot of good critique in Das Kapital, and Peterson seemed largely unaware of what that was. So they I think they each kind of approached the debate past each other, which ended up probably leading to some audience confusion or spaces for audience confusion in the beginning. But then, yeah, definitely switched to a more interesting back and forth. It took a weird turn towards sort of Christian approaches to meaning and suffering towards the tail end. But yeah, I think, if Žižek can be rightfully accused of not preparing for the debate, Peterson's preparation just kind of deliberately avoided I guess more substantial Marxist critique of capitalism and also Žižek's own specific works. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Okay. Peterson did not say that. Sorry, Dan. I think I'm going to have to challenge you to be a little bit more careful in characterizing Peterson's words here, because he did not say that he didn't bother looking at Žižek at all because Žižek writes too extensively. He said it would be impossible for me to go through all of Žižek's 36 published books, let's say, in preparation for the debate. So he read some Žižek, but he focused on the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and the whole reason I wanted to watch this debate is because Žižek is supposed to be the guy defending socialism or defending communism. And so if Jordan Peterson, does this incorrectly or attacks something that attacks, the straw man of communism rather than going right for the steel man, what I was hoping from this debate is that Žižek would provide the steel man. And that didn't happen as far as I can tell.
So I thought it was kind of interesting. Yeah, because Jordan Peterson didn't say that he read no Žižek, but his whole introductory 30-minute statement, which he gave independently, he went for 30 minutes and then Žižek went for 30 minutes with pre-prepared opening statements. Jordan Peterson's whole introductory statement, like Dan said, was basically point by point going through the Communist Manifesto, and then like criticizing various points, like history is to be primarily viewed as an economic class struggle. The struggle's binary between the oppressors and the oppressed. He was criticizing like these main ideas of the Communist Manifesto. And then Žižek did not really defend any of those points because I'm not sure that he believes so strongly in exactly the argument that's laid out in the Communist Manifesto. So Žižek went basically on a winding, Žižek's intro was like a winding journey talking about like today's China and how the Chinese state is very successful at capitalism, even though it's very authoritarian. Let's see, what else did he talk about? He talked about the stories that we tell ourselves and like how ideology influences
narratives affect people, like with Hitler selling these easy answers about the Jews and things like that.
Yeah. He also criticized Jordan Peterson for kind of scapegoating cultural Marxism as a bogeyman in order to like avoid some tensions that are maybe going on in Western society. And he talked a little bit about the rise of Trump and how liberals in America don't want to take a look at how society could have given rise to Trump. He criticized PC culture as well. I mean, he went through a lot. Like Žižek, when you listen to him talk, he's kind of, thinking laterally, not so much point by point. He was weaving a tapestry, I guess we could say, that didn't have really anything to do with the Communist Manifesto.
So if we could, I don't know if there is a central theme behind Žižek's opening statement, or if it's just a whole bunch of criticism of various current ideas.
Right. Yeah. So if I can to summarize my understanding of Žižek's position, it's basically like all ideologies suck, and like there's a criticism that can be levied against basically any idea, and we seem to be coming closer and closer to this apocalyptic event where capitalism collapses because it's just too exploitative or something like that. But he doesn't have any kind of clear solution to the problem. He basically is just like, yeah, it seems like we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, and the light at the end of the tunnel is actually just an oncoming train, and we're all about to die.
Specifically, I think that he's concerned about environmental catastrophe, and he called for more international cooperation on environmental issues. Not anything specific. I'm not sure exactly what he wants. I'm curious, Ariel and Dan, did you, or all of us, I mean, what do we think is Žižek's thesis, if Žižek has a thesis? Or is that just the wrong way to look at it?
Well, I'll characterize some of the threads that I got from his presentation. And it's also interesting because both Peterson and Žižek were like, well, we kind of don't like the premise of the debate in terms of which ideology is better suited towards happiness, because happiness is problematic. But one of the things that Žižek says in his opening statement is that, specific over-commercialization of everything that is kind of symptomatic of capitalism does lead to different kinds of stressors that people have to deal with. And Peterson seemed to agree with that point. And when he's talking about different kinds of problematic capitalist production that is leading towards ecological collapse, I think you're right, Katie, that he didn't have a specific solution other than vague international regulatory consortium of some kind that's probably not democratic. And then just sort of leaves it at that with his sign off that I'm a pessimist. And Chris recaptured it by saying the light at the end of the tunnel is probably an oncoming train. But then instead of proposing an additional solution, towards the end of the debate, his critique of Peterson's position is, ceding the solution. He says, I don't really know what the solution is, but ceding it at the responsibility of the individual is kind of problematic because likened it to asking a North Korean to kind of solve their political situation or improve their lives by addressing or getting their own house in order. So, you know, his sort of positive attacks against Peterson seem to be saying individual responsibility as the primary focus seems to be kind of problematic, but doesn't offer positive material of his own as a counterpoint other than a vague hypothetical international conglomerate.
Yeah, I find that criticism about North Korea really hollow, because it's like most of us don't live in North Korea, so
it's a communist state.
And Peterson addressed that criticism too. I guess to answer the question that Katie asked before, like what are the central themes of Žižek that I can identify? I think the ones that really stood out for me in this debate were this seems like this idea, like the hyper commercialization of culture is like really central. Like he seems to be saying the hyper commercialization of culture is somehow undermines the Protestant work ethic, which sustains capitalism. And it seems like he's making it. It seems like after listening to the debate and reading about him this week, it seems to me that might be his central argument about why capitalism is doomed, because there's that tension there, or at least that's one reason why capitalism is doomed, because he talks about that, but he also talks about, I guess more obviously, like the problems with managing global commons, like environmental and social, and there was a third one. But the idea that like there are these problems that really can't be solved by the free market, and that you need to have some kind of international non-market based solution to deal with them. And so that's one argument, which is, but then there's one about the Protestant work, like the hyper commercialization of the Protestant work ethic is also interesting. And I think nested in a lot of the stuff he was saying were like criticisms of Peterson that I think could be like, I think almost like there's some of them were so subtle, I don't think they were even addressed. Which we can get into that a little bit more later, maybe.
Well, yeah, and so all of these criticisms that Žižek leveled at capitalism, I think Peterson did a good job of addressing. He did say, you know, capitalism is not perfect. It is the best system that we know of, and indeed, it's been working really well, pretty much since it started. You know, we have this kind of exponential increase in global wealth and this very dramatic decrease in the amount of global poverty and all that. And yeah, you know, he mentioned, you know, there is, that aspect of capitalism that encourages advertising and marketing and you know, commercialization, commoditization of everything, which kind of tends to cheapen things. But he said, you know, there's a tension between that and you know, the individuals in society who shoulder responsibility, and that tends to counteract the negative effects of capitalism.
It's interesting because like the Žižek actually like kind of addressed that, and I feel like his counter argument to that was never addressed, because he basically like brought up Dostoevsky's like Garden of Eternal Paradise, which Peterson initially brought it up. He brings it up all the time. But then Žižek kind of went back to it and was like, because Peterson talks about this idea, like Dostoevsky brought up this idea, I think in Notes from the Underground, where he basically said that the human man is such a creature that if you put him in a garden where he had nothing but cake and leisure and sex and fun activities, within a week, he'd be creating problems, because material abundance and comfort isn't actually what fulfills a human being. And Peterson brings that up all the time. And then but then Peterson, his defense of capitalism is a very material-based one, like poverty is going down, we're getting wealth, all this stuff. And then Žižek kind of brought that up again, and he was like, wait, well, capitalism kind of produces this situation of like the man, like Dostoevsky's man in the Garden of Paradise. And he even like compares it to like the situation in Czechoslovakia in the late Soviet era, where he was basically making the, I think, questionable claim, but making the claim that people were relatively happy there because things were good, but they weren't amazing. So you had meat most days, but you didn't have meat every day. And there was like a paradise that you could see, and it wasn't too far and it wasn't too close. So it seems like Žižek's almost saying the conditions of late capitalism or contemporary capitalism produce Dostoevsky's Gardens of Earthly Paradise, that even though there's a lot of wealth, there's not necessarily a lot of fulfillment.
So I just wanted to bring up, we got a comment on the live stream on Facebook from Christopher Green. He said, basically, if the majority of people care about the environment, then you don't need a government to enforce environmental regulations. And if the majority does not care about the environment, then there will never be enough people lobbying for the government to create environmental regulations. This kind of, I think, is referencing Žižek's call for maybe some kind of global cooperation on environmental regulations. Did we want to address that quick?
The majority of people.
Did you have a response to that, Katie? I just need to maybe hear it restated.
Okay. Well, basically, they said if the majority of people care about the environment, then you don't need a government to enforce environmental regulations. Or if the majority of people care, then you don't need a government to enforce it. And if the majority of people don't care, then you'll never have enough people lobbying the government to enforce environmental regulations anyway. I think they're basically just saying the government shouldn't be involved in environmental regulations.
I mean, right. I think there's two ways to interpret. There's two ways to interpret, I think, that comment. I don't know if Christopher is still there, but I mean, one way you could interpret it would be that if people care about the environment, then they'll individually take steps to preserve it in their daily life. Or another way to look at it would be if people care about the environment, they'll vote in a government that'll protect the environment. So it's not totally clear how to interpret that.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I mean, obviously, the more people who care about an issue, the more likely it is that the issue will be addressed.
Yeah, there's some issues that you can't deal with on an individual basis, right? Like there's some issues that it's like if we decide, like sometimes you have to work together to get something done. There's some things that can only be created by people working together.
Being an individual doesn't deny the possibility of having a collective, like individually come together as a collective.
Yeah, exactly. The more individuals who care about an issue, the larger and more powerful of a collective they can create to solve the problem.
I mean, arguably the government is one form of such collective.
Yeah, it's one form. It doesn't have to be the only form.
Well, but what we're talking about is we're talking about lobbying the government. And the more people that you have lobbying the government, the more the more likely it is that the government will do something about it.
All things being equal, yes. However, I don't think that the way that governments tend to be influenced is by a lot of people wanting a certain issue to get passed. I think it tends to be like if you have a few influential people with a lot of money, or if you have a few people who like really know how to work the system, then you can get stuff done in the government. It's not. There's actually not a huge correlation in the U.S. between how many people. Actually, there's like zero correlation between like how many people support any given issue and whether a law is passed for that issue or not.
Right. So what you're saying is that it's really about the amount of money rather than the amount of people.
The amount of influence.
Well, not necessarily money.
Not necessarily money, but influence.
Okay, but money and influence are, for
example, where like where. You'll have like one small group of activists who hound a particular congressperson who's on a particular committee, and they can get a law passed very quickly.
Yeah, sure. But again, the more people there are pushing that agenda, the more likely it is for that the Congress people will, want to hear about it. Especially, maybe Congress doesn't listen to people who are just complaining about things on social media, but it certainly seems that that's how electoral politics is done. Like, just look at the race between all the Democrats right now. I mean, basically, they're all just kind of espousing opinions that seem popular on the internet right now. And they're doing that because those opinions are popular and have a lot of support.
Yeah.
Now, anyway. do the policies that get enacted actually reflect those things? Maybe not. But it seems like if we get, somebody in office who, has a really radical platform based on, what they perceive as popular. I mean, actually, Trump is a good example of this. I mean, yeah, basically, he just went out to the people and was like, what are people yelling the most about? And that'll be my platform. And then he does actually seem to be enacting some of that. So,
I like it. With the Yang is picking up. A lot of people talk about UBI. So we went and, did a whole bunch of research with it. And now he's trying to sell it to the US public. So
I think that's a really popular idea right now.
Yes. And he defends it very well. Yeah. One thing I wanted to mention when we were talking about this Garden of Eternal Paradise situation. I have seen, like, say in Malaysia. Malaysia is kind of a new money country. Like they just come into wealth probably in the last 20 years or so. There's the oil money and stuff, and there's so many malls in Kuala Lumpur. It's like there's nothing to do in Kuala Lumpur except go to the mall. And I think there's this sort of cycle of culture, like a growth cycle. So it's sort of like when a kid is young and he's 16 and he gets his first job and he has that like $200 paycheck and it's like, make it rain, like I'm gonna buy all this stuff. You know, he doesn't know how to use wealth wisely. The only way he knows how to use wealth is just to spend it on whatever frivolity, right? So I think cultures are likely to develop in this way too. So eventually, you know, this kid grows up and he studies a bit about money, like money, he learns that hopefully that money isn't just a toy, that money is also a tool and can be used to build prosperity and create greater goals or fulfill greater human drives like that get closer to happiness. And so I expect that eventually cultures are going to start to learn that you can't just get happiness through mindless consumerism. You have to actually be intelligent with your money and use your money for things like buying yourself time to think about what you really want to do, or finding some way to contribute to society. And I do think there are seeds of that already, and there are probably fruits of that already.
Yeah, it's interesting because it seems like that's a lot of like what Peterson talks about is like how to be responsible in life and like with money and stuff like that, and how to be a responsible person even in this like society that we're in that's consumerist and that has all these problems. And so it seems like there's a response to Žižek in that, which could like break this cycle that Žižek is worried about like consumerism destroying the Protestant work ethic. And so I would have liked to hear them talk more about that. I thought that was really interesting because it seemed to get at some of the central, at least Žižek's central argument, or one of his central arguments, I think.
What do you think of this idea of kind of the commodification of culture? Like, personally, I think I kind of know what he's getting at. Like, a lot of times you'll see a very authentic event, even like an activist event or cultural event. A good example was where I grew up. There was a big LGBT pride parade every year. And then over the years, it will become increasingly commercialized, and the feel of the event will go from being something that's very community focused and organic to something that feels like a big advertisement parade. I mean, there's still a lot of good in it, but it changes the feel of it completely. And I think that does kind of affect happiness and especially meaning. You know, like both the Žižek and Peterson talked a lot about like searching for something deeper and searching for meaning and kind of like falling into these things, and this authenticity is being part of happiness. And I do think that the commercialization of culture can negatively affect that.
Yeah, it's something I've seen a lot in hip hop. So like in the 80s, breakdancing became popular and everybody was trying to cash in on that. They were making movies about it. And then it got so popular that it got forced back underground. And then you had like the more political hip hop, like Public Enemy and stuff. And then the gangster rap kind of got really popular with Tupac and then Snoop Dogg and stuff. And yeah, I think it makes it cheaper, obviously. It makes it not what it once was. And this is actually, I guess this is a longer cycle with black music in the US, because it tends to be what goes on, like the music gets forced underground and people come up with something new and different, and then it gets exploited until it's meaningless.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see this a lot in sort of subcultures that become popular, where you have, this small group of people who are all working together, and they all have this kind of shared sense of meaning, and they're all getting stuff done. And then, suddenly they reach this tipping point where, they can just do a bunch of marketing and not necessarily provide more value beyond that point. They just kind of like, okay, now we're well known. Now we can just exploit this by putting out kind of shallow, meaningless stuff. And yeah, I think that kind of almost everything seems to kind of go that way. Everything that has meaning seems to eventually kind of, at the very least, like cycle in and out of meaning. Like maybe there's this kind of peak meaning, and then this kind of like peak nihilism, and then maybe it comes back. Maybe it gets rejuvenated. But I do think that Žižek and Peterson kind of more or less agreed on that point, that in both a capitalist system and a communist system, if you take on some responsibility for yourself, you'll probably have a much more meaningful life than if you just sit in the Garden of Paradise and enjoy all of your material wealth, but never actually try to produce anything of value. So I think they definitely both agreed on that. And actually, to me, it just feels like this debate. It felt like Žižek kind of forfeited the debate, like right at the beginning, and then they just had a conversation, and then Peterson just kind of brought him over to his side, and they both were like, "Yeah, let's do this again. Like we agreed on everything. That was great."
I think one area of disagreement between Žižek and Peterson that I can identify, like to get back to the commodification of culture question, is like one thing I used to think about a lot when I was reading more Marx is like this idea that something that money does is it imposes like a universal standard of value on everything it touches. So money creates like an equivalence between everything that you attach a monetary value to, and that can be like so my table becomes quantitatively comparable to this apple, becomes quantitatively comparable to my shirt, becomes quantitatively comparable to an education, becomes quantitatively comparable to healthcare, becomes quantitatively comparable to parts of my body that I can sell. And it's to the point where it's kind of related to like what we were talking about yesterday with like I think Martin Buber, the I and thou guy. I and thou. Yeah. So it's like the idea that you can either relate to everything in the world as like a set of objects, and they each have a certain utility or value to you that you assign to them. And then you're just like, you're going through the world like an operator, like using things and seeing what's useful and what's not useful and categorizing things that way. And capitalism and money really encourage that. And Peterson talks about the value of that. There's definitely a value to that. But there is some way that like the spiritual essence of things that can't be quantified is lost.
Well, and I think that capitalism encourages you to think about what something's market value is, and the market value of something is almost by definition different from how you would value something. So there's two ways of looking at the table or your apartment or your kidney that you can sell or something like that. There's how much will other people value this if I sell it to them, and then there's how much is this value, how much do I value this thing. And I think honestly, it's a really good idea to look at life in terms of how you value things, because that's how you can prioritize which things are worth doing. If you're only focusing on how much the market values something, then yeah, you'll tend to overvalue things, or undervalue things.
Well, it gets back to like what Žižek was talking about a little bit, like the culture of commodification is like the market gets into our heads too. Like it's not just that we're like these like beings that are like in our own little temples and we value certain things and we value them because our soul wants us to value them. Like he said like the totalitarian society or the market, like it gets into our heads, or you have like Peterson talks about this too, like ideological possession. Like you're not just yourself, you're also all these like little chattering mini personalities. And it's like, do I really want like the Mars bar, or is that really like me valuing it, or is it something else?
I think oftentimes it's something else. Granted, Chris, I mean, you're right. Like individuals within whatever kind of system can place their own value judgments on things, but so much of what we value is based on what subliminal messages that we're receiving. Like advertising is a multi-billion-dollar industry for a reason. It absolutely works. And there's studies, like I think if you show somebody the same image like 8 times, it takes a certain amount of exposure to like get an idea or a desire into somebody's head. And like oftentimes the more they're exposed, the more it becomes kind of part of their unconscious psyche. And then you can get desires springing from that otherwise may not have been there.
Right, exactly. So we have these values, these internal values, and certainly most people probably put a little too much value on, they let other people's values influence their own values. And to a certain extent, you want to do this so that you can, align yourself with your society. But if you only pay attention to what your society puts value on, then that cheapens the hell out of your life, and probably makes it feel kind of depressing and meaningless.
Yeah, it's interesting also because it's like, it's not a simple decision, right? Like, am I going to be an independent person or am I going to be a conformist? I choose independent person. I've made the choice. Like, it's not a simple conscious decision. Like, it's like Žižek and Peterson both seem to recognize that it's like so much of what influences us is like deep in our subconscious, either from our own lives or from how we've been conditioned by society. And often like the choice to be like a simple rebel is like a greater conformity even than being a conformist. So it's like the process to actually be a free thinker. I think at one point, I forget which of them, I think Žižek, I don't want to say the wrong one, but one of them said like, you have to always live on the edge of, you have to live at the edge of your ideas and at the edge of your comfort and at the edge of your beliefs. And you always have to be like, basically like this being of moral courage to be able to be really.
Yeah. I think a lot of people kind of fall into that trap of kind of appearing to be a free thinker by being like a hipster or like a hipster's hipster. And by that, I mean like looking at something that's popular and being like, critical of that thing, being like, I hate that thing, because so many people like it and it's cheap and whatever. And I remember I used to have this friend in college who was like, I used to call him like the hipster's hipster, because he would look at all the stuff that was popular because it was hipster, and he would say all of that stuff sucked, and he would only like the stuff that was like really unpopular. and to me, Žižek seemed kind of like that, where he was just like criticizing everything, and he was just like, look how cool I am, I can criticize any idea. And it's like, well, yeah, great, but what do you actually like?
Yeah, I think I found there to be a manipulative element to how Žižek was approaching the debate. Like, and he fully ahead of time said that like he had a manipulative intent, which was like to turn people who were like anti-PC like towards the left instead of towards the alt-right, basically. That was one of his.
Actually use the word manipulative, or how
he probably didn't use the word manipulative, but he talked about his motivations. He said his motivation wasn't really to engage with Peterson. His motivation was, there's a video on the RT where he says one of his motivations was to not appear the coward before Peterson's challenge, and his other motivation was to convince people who were disillusioned with PC to remain on the left, basically, which is not necessarily a negative thing, but he could say that.
I mean, I don't know. Like, for one, he's saying that in interviews, and for two, like when I watch a debate, I assume that people on both sides of the debate are trying to convince me.
Yeah, it's not really that I found manipulative, but it's more, I mean, I think he is to a certain extent manipulative, and he would admit to being a little bit manipulative. Like, he does admit that, but I found it a little bit manipulative just how he was like, he seemed like he was bringing up a lot of like hot button issues, or like focused on how he was being viewed, I guess. Maybe more so that it seemed like Peterson's motivation was more to, Peterson almost seemed like he was trying to impress Žižek a little bit.
Okay, so here's a different interpretation. Peterson called out Žižek to debate Marxism and then did a point-by-point analysis of the Communist Manifesto. Žižek goes on and says, okay, I'll do this debate, but really what I want to do in this debate is just have people understand my ideas. And Žižek clearly isn't like a Marxist in the sense of being a clear proponent of everything in the Communist Manifesto. Like, he was even praising capitalism in some sense, like market economics, for bringing a lot of wealth to the world, and basically just calling for more international environmental regulation. So maybe, I don't know, it probably would have been more honest for Žižek to say, like, actually, I'm not what you think I am, but I'm happy to go on and talk about ideas. But at the same time, too, like, Peterson basically came on and laid out a whole argument for something that really doesn't have anything to do with what Žižek writes or promotes.
Well, and here's another element that, so Peterson lays out, this, or let me back up. I don't think Žižek saying good things about capitalism is any kind of him forfeiting the debate, because even in the Communist Manifesto that Peterson spends his first statement going through, Marx and Engels talk about how, basically it is only the material surplus that industrial production allows for that workers can actually talk about in a serious way, overthrowing longstanding power hierarchies that have controlled material conditions for thousands of years, right? So that appreciation for increases of production is in like the prologue to, just Marxist interpretations of what should come after. And then the critique, which is also, again, a Marxist thought pattern that Peterson himself repeats, is that there are problems when over-commercialization basically devalues the the non-material or the sort of like the numinal impulses that people might engage in their day-to-day activity. So like the fact that Peterson is using that same language is he doesn't spend any time acknowledging that that's something that the manifesto that he was critiquing has as one of its very important core conclusions. So it's not really a gotcha. I don't really see how anyone could view that as a gotcha moment for Žižek, because again, that's in the prologue.
I think it would be tough to have a gotcha moment for Žižek in general, because Žižek. My main frustration was Žižek.
When you don't take a position.
I mean, my hot take on this whole debate is that Žižek, it looked like basically Žižek intentionally forfeited the debate. I mean, he comes in, he just completely like throws off the framework, and he's kind of unprofessional, right? Like he just kind of like he doesn't stick to the format of the debate. He's talking, over the moderator like at the beginning. He's got this really like distracting way of talking where he's like touching his face, and actually he managed to like not touch his face at all, like in the beginning of the debate, and you could tell he was like fighting against it, and he started like picking at his shirt to kind of like do that instead. But it's almost like he unconsciously like his conscious thoughts and his unconscious actions are just completely opposite. Where like unconsciously it looks like he almost he had the intention of just like coming in there and just putting on the worst face possible for Marxism, because that's I mean that's basically like he, again, he's just kind of like this old, like totally incoherent, anyway, I can keep going with this, but that was my impression.
Well, it makes me wonder. I don't think he was exactly trying to do this, but I wonder if it's a factor. So there's a couple of ways of looking at it. Like one way is this troll who is just like, hey, you beat me, bro. No, no contest, right? And that makes it very hard for someone to actually come at you and make it look like they win because you've conceded so easily. Or the other way to look at it is like this jujitsu thing, like yield to overcome, like there's nothing there, and so I can redirect your energy.
I don't think this was a debate. I don't think it was him forfeiting the debate. I think it was more Žižek exploring ideas in his kind of stream of consciousness way, like he always does. Even though it was set up as a debate, I think that's just what he did. I don't know that he was like intentionally trying to derail anything. I think that it was just Žižek being Žižek and approaching philosophy and conversations as Žižek does.
Right, which is to say, he didn't argue at all in favor of any position. He just argued against Peterson's positions and his own positions.
Well, that might be interesting. If we listen again, we might have to go through and say, okay, so what clear positive claims has Žižek made?
Well, so here's a couple, so yeah, Chris, I disagree with your outcome of the debate that he somehow forfeited in the positive, over the course of it or in the early stages, because both of them, agree that happiness is maybe not the best lens to view certain kinds of human flourishing. But Žižek does say in his opening statement that over commercialization that is a result, is basically symptomatic of capitalism, causes certain kinds of unhappiness or devalues the types of happiness that a lot of people are capable of achieving. And Peterson actually agrees with that statement. Which
but that's an argument against capitalism, is what I'm saying. I'm saying he's not arguing for anything.
So if you're okay, but if your statement about the debate, which again, both speakers said that they had issues with the thesis, but as far as the thesis of the debate was, or the premise of the debate was, which ideology has more to tell us about happiness as a condition, Žižek provides an answer for why capitalism isn't the answer. And then Peterson talks about, his view towards flourishing is more to do with, just this Judeo-Christian struggle paradigm. But again, that's not a defense of his side. If you're issuing a fair critique that Žižek doesn't really present too much about what Marxism does for happiness, that's fair. But at the same time, Peterson doesn't really do that, aside from saying, okay, well, if everybody's poor, then you're going to suffer. But again, that's something that even the source material for his opening statement had acknowledged. So I would say that Peterson also didn't, so if your critique is that Žižek didn't use Marxism to talk about a path to happiness, Peterson doesn't really do the same thing for capitalism. So I just want to make sure that that's, that there's parity on that particular issue.
Not necessarily about happiness, but about human flourishing. This was part of his opening statement. He said that he felt that capitalism alienates people from their potentials, and that if you have a basic level of equality, he talked about equality of opportunity, but included in equality of opportunity, he included like basic things like if people have healthcare, if people have access to education, etc., then that allows people to grow creatively, and having that, like, the basics taken care of can allow for the flourishing and even more differences in outcome over time than if everybody has to work just to get to the basics. He didn't go too deeply into that point, but that was one thing that he said, which I think is an argument for some kind of a socialist system.
I guess so, but he doesn't actually advocate any system. All he says is, here are some problems with capitalism. And Peterson basically says, well, yeah, those are some problems with capitalism, but here's how personal responsibility can solve those problems. Whereas Žižek is kind of just like, I don't really know how to solve those problems.
Peterson does have more of a positive program than Žižek.
And actually, I thought it was really interesting how the debate kind of ended up. It kind of, and I said this before, where I was kind of just like, yeah, it seems like Peterson is really, like, he was really nervous going to the debate, and he you could tell he took it extremely seriously, and he was basically just, you could tell he was like, oh my God, like, I am responsible for supporting capitalism. And it seemed like Žižek did not take the event nearly as seriously as Peterson did. And so he kind of was just like, no, we're not going to have a debate, like, right at the beginning. Whereas Peterson was kind of like gearing up for a debate. And then towards the end of the discussion, it kind of seemed like, to me, Peterson was almost kind of subtly accusing Žižek. It was kind of like Žižek on the couch, like Peterson was kind of just like psychoanalyzing him and being like, wow, this is an interesting guy. He seems to like not actually say what he means. And he started saying like, well, it's probably a good idea to, like set your own house in order before you set other people's houses in order, or whatever the rule is. And he's like, and tell the truth, or at least don't lie. And to me, I felt like he was kind of like, like psychoanalyzing Žižek a little bit, and maybe even giving him some advice.
It got more interesting at the end. To me, it was the opening statements were interesting, but less interesting than when they were actually sitting down talking to each other, because their opening statements weren't really engaging with each other, and they were just kind of talking past each other, like we said. But towards the end, they did get to a point where I felt like they were more just connecting as people and talking about human potential for happiness and what is happiness versus meaning. And is happiness even a goal that we should be shooting for? And, Žižek was asking Peterson questions, and they were kind of going back and forth, engaging with each other's ideas. And I thought that was good. That point where Peterson said, get your house in order, is before trying to influence the world, is where Žižek came back with the criticism that, like, you obviously wouldn't say that to someone in North Korea.
Why wouldn't you say that to someone in North Korea? Like, what else are you going to say to them?
Because you don't, if somebody's clearly being, their life is being ruined by an extremely oppressive system, you don't tell them, fix your life before you try to criticize the system. Because sometimes the reason why your life is messed up is because of these outside influences.
Yeah. Well, sorry, you saying something, Chris? You're on mute.
Why don't you just go ahead, Kurt?
Okay. So this is a form of argument that I've heard many times. Like, I remember I mentioned to a friend of mine, I'm reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and, it's about taking responsibility for your own financial position and this sort of thing. And people will come back with these ideas like, well, what about a child in Africa? They can't improve their financial position. Or what about, the poor child in Chiapas, the native child who can't read and doesn't have any opportunities? But that's it's just creating this impossible position, creating this idea of somebody who can't improve their position at all, even though you don't know. Like, I don't know what life is like for somebody in North Korea. I do know that generally people should take responsibility for, generally it will be beneficial in the long term for people to take responsibility for their own situations. But it's not really possible for me to say how much that would help somebody in North Korea, but it probably would, at least a little bit.
Yeah, and I think the idea...
I don't think he was saying that somebody in North Korea can't improve their lives by taking responsibility. I think he was saying that you shouldn't tell somebody who's being oppressed that they need to fix their life and have a good life before they can speak out against their oppressor.
Yeah, he's not saying that you have to fix your life before you can speak out against the system. He's saying you have to fix your life before you can fix the system, right? You can still speak out against the system and you can still call it oppressive or whatever. But I think Jordan Peterson's main point, in this main point here, is that maybe you are oppressed. Maybe there's a whole, maybe you're at a huge disadvantage and there's all these evil people who are exploiting you, but there's a little tiny thing that you can affect. Okay. And if you take responsibility for that one little thing that you can affect, then you'll get better at affecting that thing, and you'll get better at taking responsibility for more stuff, and you'll be able to, and you'll grow your power that way, and it'll kind of spiral upwards until eventually, you do end up breaking out of the system. And I think it's also important to point out that just yelling about your grievances rarely actually improves the system. What actually improves the system is people taking responsibility and building a new system.
Well, I'd say also I would add that a big part of Peterson's response to that question was it was interesting because he basically was saying that you address the things that intervene in your own life. So if you are someone who lives in North Korea, for example, it's unlikely that you'll be able to govern your life well in any way because the government is so deeply oppressive. And so if you even try to take basic steps of improving your life, you will run into the government very quickly. And at that point, you will have a responsibility to confront the government. And part of I think part of what Jordan Peterson would say is that if you know, for those of us who are lucky enough to be living in a wealthy Western country, there's a large extent to which we can fix our own lives before we run into government tyranny. But if you're someone living in an oppressive state, part of putting your life in order will be to like get involved in politics in some way or to confront tyranny very soon. And I think that's why Peterson said so quickly, like, I'm not asking people to martyr themselves. He was qualifying himself in that way. And I think he didn't totally make the leap of logic clear, but that's how it came off to me.
There's another couple of examples that I think of, which are, they're a bit funny, but let's see how this sounds. So there was the dictator, I guess, of Taiwan after they set up their own thing from China, right? And he started researching things. He was son of the previous dictator, and he started researching different systems of government. And he said, hang on, if I want my country to be prosperous and people to be fulfilled, we need to move away from this system of dictatorship. So this is him cleaning his room. He said, let's set up a liberal democracy in Taiwan. And that's exactly what he did. Similarly, in Thailand, King Rama IX traveled the world and saw how things were in Britain and other countries. And he said, hang on, we've got this oppressive caste system in Thailand, and it's really holding people back. So let's get rid of it. So he basically, like, in a manner of speaking, he emancipated people, because they weren't quite slaves, but the caste system was pretty strict. So by him setting his house in order, he changed things for others. Now, not everybody has that kind of power, but I do think if individuals set a good example, that might eventually be reflected in political leaders as well.
Yeah, agreed.
That's an interesting point. I mean, there have been a couple other examples. I think it was, is it Liechtenstein, another country where you have monarchs giving up a significant portion of power to their states.
So I just want to offer a different way of viewing that, because when you're talking about leaders engaging in systems thinking and making decisions that are affecting other people, it's probably not the case that these dictators or monarchs engaged in, like a whole lot of stoic meditative work or engaged in a whole bunch of discipline practices. I mean, what you were describing, Kurt, sounded more to me like somebody looking at a collective system and then making decisions based on how it would affect other people, which seems like pretty much the opposite direction of the initial approach that Peterson is recommending. So I can understand how Peterson gets from individual self-discipline increases capacity for you to positively affect other people as you take on more responsibility. But I mean, based on, I can't think of too many social changes or political movements that affected either positive or negative outcomes where the start was those political leaders just did a whole bunch of self-discipline work before they started engaging in activism. And, maybe Peterson has predictions that people who do that kind of thing will be more effective, but I still don't understand why, that top-down, or why he just spends so much time on the individual level, other than that's, part of his setup, right? The more people that subscribe to it, the better off he is, just sort of financially in terms of social capital. But that doesn't really seem to be how cooperative movements or big social changes or even top-down power abdications actually work. So I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts about that.
God, Dan, you are so cynical about Jordan Peterson. Okay, Katie.
I was going to say, I would disagree with that. I mean, well, we really don't know. For one, like, how do we know what kinds of personal development or what kinds of self-work that activists or famous figures in political or historical movements did before they got famous or during? And I think a lot of the process of, like, in order to become a well-known activist, or if you want to produce consistent work and develop a good reputation, the advice that he's giving is things that you would kind of naturally do along the way in order to get to a successful and influential point. Maybe it's not necessarily conscious in every case, but I think that, like, generally speaking, people who make really large impacts on the world have done a lot of, I don't know, they've probably done a lot of work, or certainly I don't think it would hurt. Like, you, at the very least, you need to have a lot of self-assuredness and self-confidence in order to be putting yourself out there and speaking up and working hard consistently, even in the face of significant challenges.
Yeah. And I would say, again, like, Peterson's not advocating that you go into, like, your, crystal forest of solitude and do all kinds of self-work and turn yourself into, like, a perfect person, and then you come out and do activism. Like, he says in his response to that question, like, he basically just suggests that people deal with the problems that present them, that the world presents to them. So if you're, like, he would probably say, like, if you were, like, a Black person living under Jim Crow, then Jim Crow is something that, like, affects your life. It's a problem that is, like, affecting you. And so you approach it in an honest and forthright way, and following, like, all these, like, basically rules of, like, virtue and integrity. Whereas, like, he would probably say, in that case, like, I guess if you're a white person too, it would also affect your life. He would say, in that case, like, you deal with the problem that's in your life and in your community, even if whether it's a political problem or not. Versus, like, he would probably have more of a problem with someone like, I don't know, if I say, like, I want to be a revolutionary, I'm going to go to Rojava and join the revolution there, even though, it has nothing, it doesn't have, it maybe indirectly has to do with me. I guess everything is indirectly connected, but it's not so much, I'm more intervening on that situation. It's not intervening on me.
Yeah, and Peterson made a great point about this exact thing. The more local the problem that you, like, the first problem, like, the more local you can go, the better, because you'll actually directly experience the negative consequences when you make mistakes, and then you'll learn from your mistakes. And he specifically said, if you're solving other people's problems, then you actually might never experience any personally negative consequences. And so you might think that you're actually solving other people's problems when really you're just causing a lot of pain, but you don't even know, because it's not, it's not directly affecting you.
That's a great point. I guess Zizek's response would be, like, the internationalism thing, that there's certain problems on a certain scale that that we're going to have to deal with before they personally affect us. Like, you could say, like, maybe climate change, if we're accepting that climate change is catastrophic, that it's coming, and that by the time it starts affecting us, it's going to be too late to do anything about it, then that would be, I guess, a counter argument.
I think another counter argument could be that sometimes you have problems where, like, for example, if you're talking about a problem that affects specifically children, or a problem that affects specifically animals, or a problem that affects specifically people who come from a really impoverished area where they don't have internet connectivity or something like that, you might need outside advocates, because otherwise situations where the ones affected don't have a voice would never be addressed. But I mean, in general, I agree that, like, making sure that your own life is in order is a good thing in life, or in activism, and that you're going to be more effective, the more effective you are as a person in general.
Yeah, and another thing that Peterson brings up is that people who make, I think is what he said was $5,000 a year, once they cross that threshold and they're earning more than that, they actually start worrying about the environment, and they start, lobbying for change. And so, and what he says is, well, capitalism is actually the cause of all of these, super poor people becoming, richer over time. And so capitalism is actually having this effect where, suddenly, a whole bunch more people are worried about climate change than there used to be, because of the wealth effect of capitalism.
Yeah, actually, I've read that environmentalism used to be a big conservative issue in a lot of countries, and people on the left were like, are you serious? Like, you're talking about saving the environment and forests and everything? I gotta eat.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
now, yeah, it's kind of reversed.
Yeah, it's ecological conservatism, right? Or environmental conservatism. It's I want to conserve this particular climate exactly how it is. So to me, yeah, that does strike me as a super conservative position.
Do you guys think that that a communist or a socialist system would inherently be less environmentally destructive? Like I think that's part of, I don't know if Žižek would argue that, but I think that's a lot of what a lot of leftists argue, is that capitalism itself is driving this consumerist impulse, which is what's driving so much environmental destruction so quickly. So like even if it enriches people to the point where maybe then they care a little bit more when they have time to care, that it's the cause of the problem in the beginning. I really don't know if socialist states have a better track record. They don't really have a better track record with anything that I'm aware of, but maybe with environmentalism.
There's this example with the rainbow gatherings where someone told me that they have this big problem because there's all this human waste and they don't know what to do with it. If you leave it out exposed, then flies come in and flies get on the excrement and then they bring it back to the food tent and then everybody gets sick. So they bury it all and then they pour lye on it, which turns out it's not good for the environment at all. So they're trying to solve this problem, in a communal way. And at least with this simple solution that they've got, not very good.
I mean, at burner events, one of the 10 principles is leave no trace. And so you're expected to just basically, usually the central organization provides some porta potties. And, like that's like the one, service that the central organization, uses, definitely needs to use the revenue from ticket sales in order to pay for. Because the event, again, like you suggested, it would either just not happen or people would just be not happy. But yeah, you're expected to basically leave no trace. And so actually I've never been to a rainbow gathering, but I wonder why they don't just, gather it all. Basically, yeah, you're supposed to gather all the trash and waste and then just bring it, back to civilization where it can be properly disposed of.
Well, I think the difficulty with rainbow gathering would be not only is rainbow gathering not capitalist, like there's no money involved. The gatherings are free and I think anybody can go, right? It's also, I don't think it's really so centrally organized. Like there wouldn't be a rainbow gathering organization to provide porta potties. That would be
but why not crowdfund something,
but it would have to be somebody doing it. It would have to be somebody doing it independently, something that the attendees were doing. And then also, I'm not sure, I think a lot of times smaller rainbow gatherings don't have any permits or anything like that and just kind of set up in national parks. And if you were trying to bring in porta potties, you would probably deal with more issues.
Dan, can you find us some statistics on the correlation between socialism and environmentalism? I know it's a big question, but just whatever you can find, maybe.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll look up some citations, but briefly, the general critiques of the amount of pollution that were coming out of the Soviet Union is if they weren't having basically, profit-based calculations or efficiency drivers that were more bottom line related. They came up with weird metrics to basically measure productivity. So there are some kind of absurd anecdotes of for industrial production, for example, they'd be measuring, this factory would be successful not based on how much profit it was making, but how much like raw tonnage of product would be produced. So instead of having like an efficient train, you'd have some 30-ton monstrosity that wasn't actually functional because the metric was just weight or something like that. So there's plenty out there to show why 20th century nominally non-capitalist states were really not good at their job in terms of doing any kind of environmental protection. But I think the kinds of leftists or sort of communist ideas of how less market-driven, growth-oriented industries would be more sustainable is presumably if you take something like advertising as it relates to fashion, right? And so like I think the fashion industry is like the number 2 or 3 polluting industry just globally. I think it's like meat production, or in no particular order. It's like the war machine, meat production, and then fashion, I think, are the top 3 industries. And if you have a scenario where you don't have people, like if you had production models that were less about quarter over quarter growth, which is kind of the capitalist ethos, and then instead of saying, okay, well, we need to increase our rate of sales or our market penetration by X amount every single time, or we'll be a failure even if we're profitable under that model, and have something where maybe you're not releasing entirely new lines of shoes or clothing or whatever, just for the sake of newness or commercializing, a sense of fashion or novelty, then you just have less production for those types of non-essentials. And that's where, at least theoretically, the environmental impacts would be mitigated under non-commercial ways of thinking about what a sustainable or a successful society might be. But yeah, I'll do some digging on some citations for non-capitalist states and then their environmental impacts.
Yeah, I think it's important that we just make some like distinctions in this conversation for sure, because like in talking about like, is socialism or is capitalism better for the environment, it's like you're talking like, what kind of socialism are we talking about? Like if we're talking about like 20th century state communism, like that's a whole big thing. And I think it would also probably be fair to distinguish between like the Soviet Union and China and like other socialist states, because those two also rapidly industrialized in the process of becoming communist. So it's like, that's a unique historical thing that you could argue isn't necessarily inherent to socialism. And then it's also like most contemporary socialists, or most young people who call themselves socialists, are either probably advocating one of two things. It's either like welfare capitalism with greater regulation, which if I understood Dan correctly was like a little bit what he was talking about, like regulation, but not eliminating markets completely, which is a fusion of socialism and capitalism. It's not really socialism, or like kind of a back to the basics, kind of what you guys were talking about with like rainbow gatherings maybe, but like this idea that like we should live in like communes on a small scale and grow our own food and be, independent communities and that kind of thing, which is a whole other model as well. So I think there's a lot of different things to compare here, and that's where it gets complicated.
Another interesting point, even if we were to just look up countries today and who has a better environmental record, and then kind of compare how capitalist they are versus how socialist they are. I mean, I would imagine that like a lot of the kind of social democracies might have a better environmental record and more environmental regulation, but I think that might be kind of because of the opinions of the people. Like most people who are more left-wing today also like care pretty deeply about protecting the environment. So in countries where you have a majority of people who are kind of social democrats, they're going to vote in socialism and also probably vote in more environmental regulations. Whereas, I mean, environmental regulation is even if you're not talking about regulation, treating the environment well isn't necessarily inherent to capitalism or socialism.
No, and this is
correlate.
And this is kind of where you get like the primitivist argument of like, a lot of the places that care about the environment the most are also the biggest polluters in the world. So the most energy close to energy neutral or pollution neutral societies are people living in a subsistence level existence, right? And that's where the primitivist argument comes in, is that like, I don't buy into this argument, but people will make the argument that like, we talk about how capitalism has increased wealth and increased all these like markers of well-being. But if you look at people in subsistence societies, people will argue that their lives are happier, even though they're the least wealthy people in the world, people who live in like untouched tribal societies basically, and they're producing the least pollution. And people will argue that it's a great tragedy that everyone's kind of getting drawn into this net of global capitalism and global, post-industrial society, and that something very important is being lost there.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that while being a primitivist and advocating that everybody go back to pre-industrial technological levels, that might be good for the environment. Another thing that's good for the environment is in 100 years or 1,000 years or whatever, we're definitely going to have advanced enough technology to clean up the mess that we made. And actually, I think that entrepreneurs are working on this right now. There are people who are making systems to clean out the oceans and remove carbon dioxide from the air and remove pollutants from the air. On a massive scale.
Okay. I would change the word definitely in that statement to the word maybe. Like, we will maybe have technology in 100 years to clean up our mess, but I would definitely not place that statement at the level of definitely.
Yeah, I mean, even if we can clean up the mess that
I disagree with that.
Trying to like restore ecosystems or like bring back the coral reefs or like repopulate the ocean with fish is difficult, even if we do clean things up. I just pulled up on the World Resources Institute.org. This was like in 2011. It looked at per capita emissions per country. And I just wanted to verify this because this was something that I thought. But the top 10 emitters per capita of like greenhouse gases, Canada is actually number 1 ahead of the United States, which yeah, I think that's different probably from what a lot of people would expect, because like in the US we have a stereotype for driving SUVs and being huge gas guzzlers. And I mean, obviously in the US it's number 2 in the world, but Canada, even with its more kind of social mentality, I think it's just because they require more heating probably. That's such a good example, because it's like Canada has such a reputation for being like we care a lot, like the people care a lot about the environment or profess to, but you see it's like, well, it's like kind of two things. It's like the tar sands, which is one of the most devastating pollution causing and emissions causing projects in the world. It's a very, very dirty crude oil mine in Alberta. So that's an environmental disaster. And it's because no other people in the world who live at this latitude and in these temperatures live in large detached homes to the extent that Canadians do. Yeah, sorry, go on, Katie. Yeah, well, Dan just pulled up the environmental performance index results. Which, Dan, is this like a ranking of how well countries are performing?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things. I didn't have time to read up on all the things that make up the index. But yeah, it's not just like gross amount of emissions and whatnot, just because that's gonna skew towards just larger countries and whatnot. But taking a quick scan of some of the countries that are on this list, the cleaner countries are some of the ones that you might expect. Some of the Nordics, some of the folks in Central Europe, and then some of the ones towards the bottom are basically the countries that have become the international recycling or trash processing centers of the world, right? So there's basically Southeast Asian countries and then island nations that don't have mechanisms to dispose of solid waste because there's just not enough land to necessarily process all of that. So you've got Bangladesh.
So Switzerland was number 1. Switzerland was number 1, and then number 2 you got France, Denmark, Malta, Sweden, United Kingdom, Luxembourg, Austria.
What is this metric?
This is the Environmental Performance Index, which is it's basically like an index. It says produced by Yale, like ranking how well different countries are dealing with pollutants. You've got like Bangladesh and Burundi at the bottom. I mean, this seems to be kind of this is almost just like a ranking of, like, for the most part, it seems like rich countries.
Oh, it's got you can look at the individual factors here. So it's got things like air quality, household solid fuels, drinking water, heavy metals like lead exposure, biodiversity and habitat. It's got like maybe 50 factors involved in the index.
Yeah. One of the commenters brought something like this up. I think it was Greg Riley. He was saying something like, if you're trying to analyze like how well capitalist versus socialist countries are doing, you also have to look at like the geopolitical advantages that different countries have. Like, we live in a global system, right? So we can't I don't think that this scale means that we should like look at Bangladesh and say, oh, the Bangladeshis are doing a poor job and like these tiny third world poor countries are like the ones destroying the environment. I mean, I think in a lot of cases, what you're looking at is countries like the US, Canada, and Europe who have a bunch of manufacturing and produce a bunch of waste, or like need a bunch of minerals mined and stuff like that. And they're doing that in these like impoverished countries who then end up with a bunch of extra trash, or end up dealing with their recycling, or like they're mining out of the DRC, and there's a bunch of issues coming from that.
And I think that kind of speaks to the limits of individualized approaches to getting your own house in order. I mean, earlier we talked about maybe the example of North Korean, individual improvement was a bit extreme, but I think the same critique could be applied perhaps even more validly to any individual or group of individuals in collective, or in developing parts of the world that industrialized nations basically pay to deal with all of the metaphorical and literal shit that gets produced as a result of just continuing consumer oriented production models. And they're like without more, without a greater, I guess, appreciation and attempt to deal with collective problems on a larger scale that includes people beyond our local community, I don't see how we don't trend towards more of just, not in my own backyard types of policies where we push negative externalities out to the peripheries, which land on less powerful, less wealthy individuals.
Yeah, I mean, this whole debate, I can tell you, kind of see it like dovetailing towards this like master slave morality again, because you got like Dan, you're kind of articulating like a slave morality, and we kind of have been leaning towards that in this conversation, where it's like you can view it one way, where it's like the biggest polluters, gross, are the biggest polluters are the biggest producers. Like you have like the United States and China, and well, Canada is kind of just the asshole of the situation, I guess. But and then you have like European countries are also massive polluters, and India is a massive polluter. So you get these like the countries that produce the most pollute the most, and you can view it in a very negative way if you view production in a negative way and be like production is mainly cheap materialist consumption, and it's this like evil thing, and pollution's this evil thing, and all these like the countries at the top, you make a very negative value judgment and be like, well, the countries at the bottom that are have worse environmental policies but are ultimately polluting less are really the victims here, and we should be more sympathetic. That's like a slave morality. Or you can view it the other way and be more be like, yeah, the United States pollutes a hell of a lot, but it's also producing a massive amount of wealth for the whole world. And like there's two ways of looking at it, right? Like you can look at it from the top or from the bottom.
Well, no, so I would push back against that a little bit, because I understand that pairing, and a lot of people use that framework, and Žižek actually criticized that framing as just saying, okay, well, basically poor folks in less industrialized parts of the world have no agency or power, and we just need to take sympathy on their plight. That's not the position that I'm trying to articulate. So there is, even in people that are advocating for less capitalistic, so the capitalist critique, or like the impulse that Žižek criticized, maybe not super clearly, and then a lot what other people in the field are doing, are the underlying ethos of just straight capitalist production is quarter over quarter increases of rates of production. Without necessarily spending as much time on like, is this valuable, or what are the costs associated with this, if an individual firm can outsource those costs and not have to realize that on their own balance sheet. So the type of production that's occurring in either the industrializing world or the industrialized world, where we're building, say, infrastructure like clean water treatment plants, cleaner energy production facilities, medical output capacity. Nobody on any side of the political spectrum, except for maybe hardcore primitivists, have a problem with that kind of thing. But what a socialist critique of capitalist modes of production, which is just quarter over quarter growth without taking a look at negative externalities, is it does create and I think it's pretty easy to say unnecessary levels of harm and production and waste that is leading towards a lot of these environmental or societal crises moments. And I don't see how you get towards changing that if the main focus is just individual self-improvement first. I mean, and to Katie, multiple of you guys have made this point, every group activity will be more effective if the leadership and the participants are engaged in self-improvement efforts. But I don't think that, these kinds of global problems can be looked at with just, primarily the self-improvement as the starting point. So that's what I'm trying to get to as the critique of the capitalist mode of production, and then also Peterson's focus on the individual first method of solving these types of problems.
Well, the thing about Peterson's case about individual first, the idea is basically focus on what you can control. So there's no way to get to anything without first focusing on what you can control. You have to start with what you can control. You can't start with things that you can't control. It's just not going to do anything. So
sure. I'll agree with that statement, but I'll disagree that the individual, clean your room scenario is the appropriate arena for what we can control, right? Because the whole history of activism is people trying to get control over spheres that they didn't previously have control over, right? So it's if you're going to say focus on what you can control, okay, fine, but it's very possibly the case that what we can control at individual and group activity levels is a much broader sphere than starting with clean your room, right? Like maybe.
Well, Dan, I think you have a point, but I also think that you're mischaracterizing Peterson to a large extent, and I think your point would come across like more powerfully if you didn't do that. Like, I mean, what Peterson's not saying like you clean your room and you self-improve and the world magically improves. Like we've made the point several times, that's not what Peterson's doing. Like it's like Kurt just said, like it's like you work within your domain of competence, and as your domain of competence expands, you can affect more in the world. So if you're like, let's say like a chemistry major or something, or you're very good at a certain kind of science, maybe it's like the best use of the individualistic approach in that case. Or what Peterson would say is you get better and better at what you're doing. You solve it. You start with like a small problem, maybe a small environmental problem, and you solve it using your scientific abilities, and you expand the size of problem that you're able to solve. And who knows, maybe you can solve very big environmental problems that way. Or, it's, I think that what Peterson's trying to get at in his approach is that like people doing activism can make the world a lot better, but they can also screw up the world in unimaginably terrible ways. And if you've never solved any problem before, you've never, carried out any successful public policy, you have no real like empirically tested experience in that domain, and your own life is a mess. So you haven't shown that you're good at managing things in any domain of life. And then you have this program for how to solve the big problems of the world, and you're off fighting to have it implemented. I think what Peterson would say is at that point, you might be the hero, like you might be the person who's able to save the world, but there's a very big likelihood that you'll have a destructive effect instead. And I guess I don't see how would you account for that, Dan? How would you account for that possibility?
Sure. I mean, well, again, and Žižek and Peterson and then other activists, all like in any spectrum, you'll find that activists talk about, or responsible activists will talk about the limits of their policy proposals or areas where they don't have expertise. But I disagree fundamentally that the idea that the best way to deal with improvements is for a chemistry major to specialize as much as possible and try to solve a specific problem on their own, rather than pooling resources and attention with other individuals that maybe have less expertise and then tackling problems from that perspective.
Again, you're straw manning though. Again, you're straw manning.
Yeah,
so I never said on their own. I never said they can't work with other people or do anything like that. It's, part of expanding your domain of competence is learning to work with other people. It's about starting with small problems and becoming good at solving them, be it with other people or alone, and then getting better at solving progressively bigger problems.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you can collaborating with other people is a skill that you can develop and get better and better at. I think, Peterson would still say maybe before you collaborate with other people, maybe you should solve something for yourself. But certainly, collaborate with people as much as you need to in order to solve whatever problem that you're trying to solve. And the more that you collaborate with other people, the better you'll get at collaborating with other people, and the larger of a group of people you can collaborate with to solve problems. So I definitely don't think that he's saying everybody needs to solve their own problems by themselves in their own little silos, and that will somehow magically fix the world. That's definitely not what he's saying.
Yeah, I would also defend Peterson a little bit here. I think that I think that he's trying to put forward like a methodology for starting small so that you can grow big in like a sustainable and iterative way, and proposing that like you should get your house in order, as he says, a little bit before. I think he's basically just criticizing the idea that like college students who are like deep in an extremist political ideology and may have studied this political ideology very much, he's probably saying that like if you haven't really done anything in your own life, then even if you read a book and have like a really big ideology, you're probably not in a position to try to like spread that ideology and start a revolution and try to change the world, because that's how a lot of like extremely horrible things have happened.
Yeah, and those are all fair observations, but so I'm I guess I'm not communicating this point very clearly, so I'm going to try a different tactic. But Chris and Ariel, you're pointing out that collaboration, increasing competency at collaboration is a skill set, and there's some gradual process by which people get better at that, and that's fine. I'm acknowledging that Peterson allows for group efforts, so I'm not saying that that's something that his system doesn't allow for. What I'm saying is that by repeatedly focusing on the individual as the starting point, that takes attention, has the potential to take attention away from group activities that have. If we start by thinking about how groups or systems can start interacting together more effectively rather than having a more micro approach, I think that has basically greater surface area for creative collaboration. And I think there are more limits to the individual first approach. So I guess that might be a more distilled way of saying, there are other ways to conceptualize problem solving rather than saying, we should just really get good at this one small scale area. And I don't, if the recommendation is start small so that you don't screw up in large impactful ways, there might be some benefit to that approach from a risk mitigation perspective. But it seems to me that by focusing at a more collective starting point, or allowing for basically more nodes to participate in a problem solving network together, again, as a starting point, then you can tackle bigger problems than sooner than with Peterson's approach.
So my response to that would be, well, maybe, if all of those individuals who are collaborating together are good at solving problems, then you'll probably get a good solution to the problem. But if you get a bunch of people who have never solved a problem for themselves or anybody else, and you get them all together in a room and they're all complaining about the status quo, but none of them actually are competent at anything, I very much doubt that group will actually affect some kind of positive change, and much more likely they'll affect some kind of, they'll do some harm.
What would actually happen is they get into a bunch of infighting because they haven't worked on their communication skills.
Right, exactly. And I think, Jordan Peterson's point is kind of like, what they tell you as to like how to start a company, how to be an entrepreneur. And that is scratch your own itch is the advice. Because, if you have a problem and you solve it for yourself, then, and you do this, repeatedly, and you get good at it, then eventually you get good at solving that same problem for other people. And at that point, once you've solved that problem for other people a bunch of times and you're really good at it, at that point, people are going to want to start paying you to do it because, well, you probably have a lot of demand on your services, and you probably can't, if you're doing it for free, you might not be able to get to everybody. And so I think it's really good advice. Like solve a problem that you're good at solving, and then basically just take incrementally more and more responsibility until you're solving big problems. And if you look at like venture capital, and you look at investors and the sorts of companies that they're willing to invest in, they always say like it has to have a good business model and a good product. But the most important thing is usually it has to be a good team. Like these people have to have a track record of execution. Like are they just going to sit around and just shoot the shit for hours and hours and hours and never actually do anything? Or are they likely to actually solve some problem and thereby make a bunch of money and get a return on this investment?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two levels that we could respond to Dan on. And I want to like kind of add something to this level that Chris is talking at now. I do want to get to a deeper level later on, which is, I think maybe where we get back to Žižek and the internationalism thing. But to add to the point Chris just made, I don't know if you guys have heard of like there's bad apple theory, which is this research that's been done where they found that like you'd like to think that like if you have a group of people working together in like a company or an activist group or something, and everyone in that group they all get along pretty well, they all work really well together, and everything is pretty harmonious. You'd like to think that if you add someone who's a little bit problematic to the group, they'll get caught up in the positive culture. But that's actually not what happens. If you add someone to the group who's either dramatic, lazy, or causes a lot of conflict. What's the third one? I forget what the third one is. But anyway, if you add in someone who's like a problematic person, and what happens is soon everybody in the group sinks to the level of the person who has a lot of vice. If you have a group of one person starts coming in late every day, then soon everyone's coming in late. So when there's a lack of virtue among individuals in a group, then the whole culture of the group sinks.
Yeah, unless the culture of the group is very strong and sort of constantly enforced.
Like in those cults we were talking about.
That's why we need laws in society, arguably, right?
To ban cults?
No, not cults. I was responding more to Chris was saying, but like, sure. But yeah, to enforce a minimum standard of behavior, basically, so that the collective behavior doesn't fall to the level of the worst person.
Right, exactly. I mean, if you have, and you see this in online communities all the time, if you have a bunch of people who are, following the culture, following the rules, and everybody's, interacting with good faith, and everybody has, the value is being produced, and then sort of a bad actor comes in, the bad actor shouldn't be able to destroy everything as easily as if, they enter in a community where there kind of aren't any rules, nothing is enforced, there isn't, basically everything is kind of tolerated. It tends to be much easier for a bad actor to take down one of those groups than something that's a little more robust.
And I think it's interesting because that tension also works in the other direction. If you're talking about what Peterson refers to a lot as hero's journey, or trying to have leadership improve behavior. I think some of the same dynamics that Chris talked about is if the norms of a society are pretty ossified and you're trying to get some kind of leader or hero or rebel trying to change a social dynamic, that's going to be a lot harder if the culture is pretty ossified compared to if there are some looser, more free-flowing norms. So that flexibility I could see it pulling in both directions.
I guess Dan, what is your positive, we didn't get much of a positive proposal from Žižek, and you're the most Žižek out of any of us in this live stream. So what is your proposal?
Yes, Steelman, your position. Yeah.
So I think the specific I think Steelman critique, just to clarify the critique, because I think that's helpful, is that quarter over quarter just sort of profit acceleration for the rate of increased returns has really bad negative externalities that lead to crisis.
Right. That's the critique. What's the positive position? What's the proposal as to how it should be done better?
The proposal for how to avoid the crisis moments is on one hand, try to reduce or curtail as much as possible the quarter over quarter kind of increased rate of returns. So I'm not sure exactly where in these marketplaces that you'd be able to implement this, but instead of, say, having companies that are really focused as their primary goal of IPOing and then having increased share prices, right? Because that's like one of the major functions by which corporations have to continue to increase the rate of expansion. I think a more stable, both culturally and environmentally approach to dealing with corporate organization and, say, finance. I don't think this is content that Žižek himself has talked about, right? So this is me speaking from sort of a based off of his critiques. This is where I'm thinking positive solutions can come from. Just to benchmark that. So instead of sort of public markets with just this crazy quarter over return growth, if we had more basically private, if we had more worker-owned organizations that were deciding what their areas of expertise were in terms of the kinds of problems that they as organizations wanted to solve, and then if they wanted to take external capital, having more of a dividends approach where we're like, hey, we had a profitable quarter because it cost us X amount to build however many widgets, and we were able to sell them for some amount of surplus. That surplus gets realized first primarily by the people involved in the productive process, and they can choose how to reinvest. But instead of just having crazy favorable laws that prioritize capital gains that are more to do with moving numbers around in ledgers versus actually talking about sustainable surplus that reaches a consumer. I think those are some like shifting the corporate model and shifting the way that tax law just favors investment vehicles over actual production are pretty big things. And then this recommendation gets a little fuzzier because I'm not sure the starting point for implementation, but actually holding organizations and then wealth producers liable for negative externalities like massive amounts of toxic waste that gets spilled out into communities, or if you have organizations that know that their production process is poisonous and dangerous to people, but they hide that information and continue to produce. I think it would be better if communities would be able to actually leverage reasonable liability damages against them. And right now, just kind of the class action lawsuits and the ability for communities to actually get damages are pretty challenging, at least in the United States. I'm not sure how easy it is in other parts of the world. But if a company, gives your community cancer, it might take you 15 to 30 years to get any kind of damages, and it might be just a fraction of your life's value that you're getting in terms of compensation, and you might already be dead at that point. So I think something beyond a standard tort claim system for that kind of production would be pretty necessary in any industrialized country, and probably even more important in the industrializing parts of the world. So I think those are some key factors that would allow for better wealth distribution. It would actually mitigate some of the negative externalities. But then if we just took away a lot of the motivation for crazy drives towards growth that don't care about those things to begin with, I think a lot of the elements that would basically have more vents for some of the tension that's being boiled up by some of the excessive capitalist impulses that seem to exist in frightening amounts globally.
Yeah, I mean, I could see a point for like your third point of like externality taxing is what I basically understand you to be saying. It sounds like your second point would basically lead to like, it basically requires like a human mind to making value judgments about the productive output of every company, which seems like would lead to many of the problems of socialism where.
Well, and like, I'm not sure if this was part of your second point, but tort law is not the only way that the U.S. Punishes companies for polluting. There's an EPA and there are environmental regulatory authorities in all the states. And those agencies are supposed to act as watchdogs on behalf of the public, so that the public doesn't have to like do this collective action thing. Like they'll fine you and jail you, even without, some kind of class action lawsuit.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that like at the point that the major polluting organizations are nominating the people that become the heads of, the EPA, I mean, particularly in the current admin, that it needs more teeth. I'll just leave it at that. Ariel, to your
more teeth, like more power, because I mean the problem that you just stated is that it's corrupted. Didn't you? Didn't you just say that?
So yeah, fair point. So in addition to actually, so here's right now, I'd say that what Chris is talking about in terms of organizations like the EPA being able to potentially fine and then jail people in the event that they're actually found guilty of some kind of criminally negligent or deliberate polluting activities. They don't have very much budget for actual investigatory work. I mean, I'm not sure how many of us can actually name an instance in the past 2 decades where like punitive action was taken against a corporation to the point that it anywhere near covered a fraction of the damages of the polluting activity, right? So if you have, if you can engage in something that's going to generate billions of revenue and then every couple of decades you pay a couple of millions in fines, that's really not an incentive to stop the bad behavior that's actually killing people, right? So when I say more teeth, I would advocate for actual so basically more budget for investigatory work, and then probably more third-party oversight of the actual, regulatory groups to avoid some of the corruption problems that you hinted at, Kurt. I think more networking, more observation, and more budget for investigatory and potentially punitive measures for companies that seem very comfortable pushing off negative externalities on innocent people would be better for pretty much everybody, except for maybe the stakeholders of the polluting organizations. But at the point where they're willing to grind up innocent people with their financially motivated activities, I don't really care as much about their financial bottom line.
So you asked about regulatory actions by the EPA, and I just shared a link in the chat. I mean, there's dozens and dozens of these actions where the EPA has gone after companies and either punished them or settled with them.
I think generally that the issue that he was pointing out was that usually the fine is much less costly than the amount of damage that was actually done, or like the fine isn't enough to actually hit the corporation hard. And I think a lot of the issue here is, I mean, the government agencies are pretty corrupt, as they typically tend to be. So
yeah, the incentives are misaligned. The incentives are kind of lined up towards corruption.
I was just going to say another issue, like if we're talking about corporations having to constantly maximize profits, corporations are literally, I mean, not only is that their incentive as an organization, they're trying to grow as organizations and organisms do, but a corporation actually has like a fiduciary duty to its shareholders to like always do the best for its shareholders. So like,
I think that's actually a problem. Because they're bound by law to do that. So it's basically like they have to put the interest of their shareholders above the environment.
Yeah.
And that's pretty awful.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but that's only for large public companies. I mean, a lot of these companies that are getting caught up in regulatory actions are not public companies.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, that's just for public companies.
Bribe, and the small companies get slammed.
Yeah. Interestingly, though, I mean, those recommendations, I don't even know. This is kind of the thing that's difficult with the debate, too, is like, I think if what you said, if you said what you said to Jordan Peterson or Žižek, probably both of them would agree that those are good ideas. And like nobody in the debate yesterday or today is invoking Marxism as a solution at all.
Yeah, like Dan, I'm curious. Like, do you do you support, because it seems like Žižek was kind of, he was even saying like, oh, I hope that Trump would get elected because he would mobilize the radical left and finally there would be this glorious revolution and we would implement communism. I'm not sure if he was being tongue in cheek about that. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes. But it sounds like what you're advocating are basically reforms that can be applied to the system rather than this kind of uprising of the proletariat, which overthrows the current established order and establishes this new system which functions differently from the current system somehow, and somehow is better.
Well, okay, yeah. So I think one recommendation, one part of my recommendation that was basically a through line even from Marx's original musings about production is he had an understanding that even in his happy fantasy land that workers would gather together in firms in order to have efficient production, right? What I'm suggesting, and this goes to Katie's point that publicly traded companies have a fiduciary, responsibility to fuck over other people if it increases the stockholder share value, right? That's bad. So if instead we make the shareholders not just folks that are able to get a couple of shares of the organization, but you have workers that are actually, if the primary stakeholders of a productive firm are the workers and workers in the management, because Peterson's point that management does add value to productive capacity is a valid one if they're good managers, right? So if the workers in the management in a firm are the primary stakeholders and that they get more of the share of the revenue than say, super execs with ridiculously disproportionate compensation structures, that is just beneficial from more wealth equal or more wealth fair distribution model. But then if we also have some more liability associated with the people in the firms, right? So if a CEO was potentially criminally people are pretty familiar with the Ford Pinto manufacturing disaster where the executives of Ford decided that it was cheaper to settle lawsuits for wrongful deaths than to do an actual recall of a lethally dangerous product. But then they were found by the regulatory agencies to be guilty of willful criminal negligence. None of the executives went to jail. If there were different environments where the people in the productive firm were actually criminally liable for deliberate acts, and you bake in due process to make sure that it doesn't swing too far in the other direction, right? But as long as productive firms get to basically act with relative impunity, right? So Chris, you mentioned that companies get fined a lot, but if they can still operate and still ruin people's lives, and they don't suffer any real damage other than just a fraction of reduced revenue for a couple of quarters, and then they're back doing the same thing, if not worse, that's not great. But I think more actual worker ownership of revenue, and then also individual members having more responsibility for the knockoff effects of their decision making. I think that would lead to less negative externalities as well. So that's kind of a through line that even early communists had been talking about, is just worker control of means of production. That doesn't mean that they're not going to try to be as productive as possible. But I think that, having them have to have an eye on negative downstream effects would be beneficial. I mean, in the same way that Peterson talks about like why it's necessary for thinkers to think of the downstream consequences of their philosophies, companies should have to have a similar responsibility for the products that they produce and the way.
So are you saying that if the workers at Ford had maybe owned a larger slice of the company, that they would have made a different decision in the Ford Pinto case?
If they own more of the company, and also then they could also be liable for criminally negligent decision making, I think they might have come to a different determination, or they'd be more likely to make a different determination.
So maybe all of the workers and the top brass who all sort of collaborate together, if they decided to make this bad decision where they put profits over people's lives, then the court could just send like literally the whole company to jail?
I think you'd probably want to have some, proportional assignment of responsibility, right? And that's already a concept that exists in most legal systems, is that people engaged in group activities, bear different burdens depending on whether they were the person that made the call. But if it were the case, say that, there were worker ownership of Ford, and then all of the workers were informed, like, hey, you guys made a product that will kill people if somebody hits the back of the vehicle. Do you want to do a recall that'll cost X amount, or do you want some people to potentially die? And if they were okay with, we'll just roll the dice and then, let more people die, then I think at least the, financial, whatever portion of financial restitution should be clawed out of the, the total members of the firm if they have collective ownership and responsibility over the decision making. I think it would be a little impractical to jail everybody. And so this departs from the conversation, just in terms of like punishment and liability a little bit. But I think more restitutive models of justice tend to be better for everyone compared to let's just incarcerate everybody. But I think that might be a little bit of a separate conversation.
I have a question, Dan. Like, are you going to be these worker-run co-ops? Like, there's a lot of worker-run co-ops that already exist all over the world, all over the West. There's companies that are run by the workers where all the workers get a share. Are you going to make it so it's mandated that all companies must be run this way? That if you want to hire someone, you must give them a share of your company? Or are you just going to say, like, you think there should be more like this and they can compete in the free market, and ultimately they'll probably prevail in the free market?
Well, I don't know if they would ultimately prevail in the free market, right? Because at the point where massive corporations like Amazon can dick around municipalities to give them favorable tax treatment, or they're going to lobby to prevent a minimum wage hike at the point where they've run the numbers and they're like, oh, actually.
Like, let's get like a little bit briefer just because we're running out of time. I get that there's all these problems, but.
So yeah, I mean, I don't think I'd mandate that every company be a worker-owned co-op, but I think if at local or state levels and federal levels and whatnot, if we could make it more tax equitable, or give fewer subsidies to the larger organizations that were not worker-owned, I think that would be fine. Because I think Spain has a policy, basically, if you have a single founder or a team of founders and they're retiring or going out of business, before the business gets put up for sale on the international market, the workers have the opportunity to collectivize and purchase the means of production. And I think that was modeled after a pretty successful multi-decade use case in the Madrigal manufacturing experiment. So I think more things like that would lead to greater number of worker-owned companies, which would lead to the positive effects that I was hinting at. But I think,
Yeah, I think it's also a problem of misaligned incentives with central banks, because the central banks give the monies to the commercial banks, or they lend it to them with low interest rates, and then it all floods into the stock market, and that makes people want to pump up the stock market and take advantage of it. But yeah, I like these models, like with Mondragon. There's Fa Sin Pa as well, Winco and Semco. That's a very interesting. I don't know if they divide dividends, but it's like the workers can vote, or the workers decide how much they're going to get paid. And it seems like a very interesting model. Aside from that, like there's certain things about their groups only have about 150 people, so everybody knows each other and they work on little projects, like little cells. And now there's also DAOs, of course, to decentralized autonomous organizations. So I'm curious, like if production can come together with a DAO, and in other industries will work with that.
Yeah, and I think an important point to bring up here is that maybe the reason why companies aren't choosing this structure is because it's not as profitable. And importantly, I mean, if you compare Spain's economy, you were saying, Spain incentivizes these worker-owned co-ops, which is great. But, if you compare Spain's economy to the U.S. economy, for instance, which doesn't have such a restriction, it's clear which one creates more value, in my opinion. So,
so not all companies in Spain are worker-owned co-ops. I think they have a little bit of incentives for it.
Right. I'm not saying they're all that way.
But they have this law that incentivizes it, and that arguably would shift the whole economy.
Yeah. So what I'm saying,
I don't know. Like, what
I'm saying is, if you require or incentivize a certain type of company which isn't as effective, then your whole economy is going to become less effective.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the reason for Spain's less effective economy, but I don't know. The thing with worker-owned co-ops for me is like, one, it's possible to start them, and people always say that like workers are going to prefer working for companies where it's worker-owned, and like, you know, you're alienated from your labor if you're an employee and not a worker-owned firm. But you just don't see too many worker-owned co-ops popping up. And I don't know if that's just because, like, you might say that these people don't have the capital or the power to start them up, but I don't think it's actually that. I don't know if it's that much better for the workers. Like, I'm thinking for myself, if I get hired as an employee, I don't want to have the responsibility of owning the company. And I don't know what would give me, or like most people, like the qualifications to make company level decisions, or that I necessarily think that's the best structure. And I don't know if it might even, it seems like it would be a greater level of commitment to the company. Like if you have to be part owner in order to get hired somewhere, like I think a lot of the benefit of being an employee is you can kind of hop around.
Yeah. And as you implied, Katie, like it would put liability onto the workers for bad decisions that the company makes. So, I mean, I think workers, when they go, you know, kind of the lower level workers who work for a company are, as Katie, you said that you would be looking for, you're looking for stability. You're looking for something meaningful to work on and predictability in your life. You're not looking to have this like extra risk where you might, you know, suddenly have less profit, or like you might be paid less because your company made a bad decision. You know, I totally agree, Katie, that workers are not looking to have that responsibility.
Yeah, I think that this kind of thinking, it gets to a lot of like Dan, like you invoked like Jordan Peterson talking about like thinking about like the second degree consequences of your actions or ideas and stuff like that. And I think that like all this stuff, like Chris was talking about before, like you were surprised that Žižek, like he didn't seem to be calling for a literal revolution. And I think it's important to distinguish between like the way that we're asking for things to be changed and the kinds of change we're asking for, because you can be a reformist or a revolutionary for any kind of political policy. Revolution means you want to tear down the system, create a new one. Reform means you want to alter the current system in some particular direction. And you can do that in any political direction, and you can advocate for socialism in a revolutionary way or for an evolutionary reformist way. And from what I can tell, it sounds like Dan is advocating for a reformist kind of socialism. And I think you would run into the same problems that you would with revolutionary socialism, just on a smaller scale. Like all these proposals you're bringing up, Dan, like there probably are merit to some of them, and externality taxes and like government action is like when government tries to direct the economy in a certain direction, it's always a dangerous thing, because you're basically taking as an act of faith that the ideas that you have in your mind are, like Jordan Peterson said, that they're right, that they're when most ideas are in fact wrong. So you're kind of assuming that the things you can imagine in your head for how you want the economy to go, that they're going to go the way that you want to, and it often doesn't work out that way because there's a limit to how much we can compute, and the world is really complex. So we often can't predict the first degree, second degree, third degree, fourth degree consequences of something like incentivizing worker co-ops or making some kind of production-based metric the standard of a company's value instead of profit, or some kind of criminal liability for externalities. Like we can't, those might be good ideas, but it's hard for us to know. And it's hard for us, they sound good when you hear them, you're like, oh, that sounds good. You know, profit's terrible. Workers are great. We like the environment. But when you put those into effect, there's a really high likelihood that there's going to be all kinds of, like most mutations are bad. When you change a system in a very sudden way, most of the time it it's destructive. Only very rarely is it creative, and when it is creative, it can be fantastically creative. But like these proposals they're very dangerous. It's like,
I think it's important to say though that like the government is already directing things. Like it is already intervening to direct things in a certain direction. Like an important example being the fact that corporations are bound to serve the best interests of their shareholders. And
yeah, and there's a reason for that law, and it's probably a good reason. Like if it wasn't for that law, a corporation could do like if you invest $1 million in a corporation to get them to build a new kind of, I don't know, in whatever hat, let's say, and instead they use that money to go on a yacht tour of the world and do lots of drugs and drink lots of champagne. And they were saying, we were networking. It was really important work and it didn't work out, but most companies don't work out, but we were doing our best. You wouldn't have any,
I think that would be considered
legal recourse.
Yeah, fraud.
And that would be investor fraud. But if there wasn't the law that companies had to work in the interest of their shareholders, or you could have, if I'm like, making a company to make webcams, and I'm like, actually, I want a company that's going to make eyeglasses instead. Then that would be, again.
Well, that doesn't have anything to do with whether or not you're working in the best interests of your shareholders. That has to do with if you're defrauding.
Yeah, that's true. I guess.
Your investors.
But that's how it's codified in the law that you're not supposed to scam people. Okay, it makes it required that you have to be consciously working to make them more money. Otherwise, basically, you could be taken to be scamming them. But I also wanted to bring up, let's frame the problem let's frame the issue this way. Do we want a central government, say these people are going to solve all of the problems in our society? And that's what happens when you get a central government like in China. Like you just have we have all these societal problems and we have this committee that's going to just solve all the problems. Do you want that, or do you want a free market where, as each problem comes up, a bunch of different entrepreneurs compete to try and solve that problem the best way? Like, which one of those is going to solve the problem better?
Well, it's not completely one or the other. I mean, generally, I think the second one is better, but it's not quite that simple, is it?
Yeah, and I think Katie made a good point that like the government already does like provide the ecosystem and direct. There already is a lot of regulation. Like Zizek made that point too, but it's a matter of degrees, right? Like I think none of us would argue with the idea that the society, like what modern Western society, has much freer markets across the board than the Soviet Union did, and that was a major factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Is you had these like I forget, was Peterson or Žižek brought it up. You had like quotas. Each company, what we brought it up to, I guess, like each factory had a certain amount of. It was told to produce a certain thing at this amount, at this quota, and then to send it here. And the companies, there was no actual market constraints on the companies, and so they would like get around it in all these ways, and it wasn't efficient for everyone and it wasn't useful for anyone. And I think we would, and I guess I'm hearing a little bit like echoes of that in Dan say, like in what Dan was saying a little bit, just in saying that we should incentivize some metric that we've decided is important for companies to produce instead of allowing the market to deal with it. And going in the direction of controlling the market to the degree that Dan is suggesting, I think there's some danger in that.
So just to clarify, so I'm not saying that we should do away with price signaling, right? But it is a strange and I think unproductive fact of the way that publicly traded companies operate, that even if a company is profitable, so their revenue is exceeding expenses, even by a significant margin, if the rate of growth is not what they originally projected, then the overall value of the company is going to decrease, even if the profit margins are increasing, just not as fast as they were expecting, right? And that leads to, and there's, I mean, even Buffett, who's perhaps, one of the globe's 2 or 3 top arch capitalists, spends a lot of times in his investor stakeholder letters talking about how that kind of quarterly incentive structure is bad, not just for the firm, but all of the sets of customers and investors and a whole bunch of other participants in the ecosystem. They're all harmed by the focus of, just capitalistic quarterly rate, just increasing the rate of growth, not really taking into consideration longevity or sustainability.
This seems to be an issue of like the investors' judgments of the value of the company, right?
But then also all of the associated tax benefits and, handouts that those companies pay the legislature to give back to them, right? I mean, it's a lot of these things are connected. So I'm not suggesting that we have some kind of command and control style, ignore price signaling economy. But I think we should take a look at getting rid of the incentives and the additional power levers that these larger inefficient institutions are saddling everybody else with, including the bills and the real impact for all of the negative externalities. So that's, that doesn't ignore price signaling. People are still able to make efficient decisions. And I would say that that's a more realistic account of efficiency. It's so if you're a company that like poisons and kills people and then doesn't have to face liability about that, but to Chris and Kurt's point, maybe a smaller firm with less good lobbyists or lawyers do, then that's not the market or the consumer winning out there. That's basically protected rent-seeking firms avoiding responsibility, then pushing off the costs to other folks, including their laborers and their customers.
Okay, let's take it a completely different direction. Maybe one thing I thought was really interesting towards the end was how Žižek brought up. I felt a little bit vindicated because he brought up how a lot of these like Eastern philosophies can be used to justify all kinds of atrocities and violence. Briefly, his argument was like he brought up how Zen Buddhists supported like Japanese imperialism. To a large degree, and how you can use that kind of mentality of like distancing yourself from like I guess the veil of illusion, you might call it, and just going with the flow of things to allow yourself to basically be a very effective soldier, to carry out great violence and all these things. I thought that was really interesting and very topical to what we discussed a few weeks ago. So I was wondering if Kurt and Katie, if that brought up any. If you guys had thoughts on that.
I did.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kurt.
Okay. Actually, it makes me think of one of my teachers, a Buddhist. Actually, somebody asked him about this clip where the Dalai Lama swatted a mosquito, and the teacher said to us, it's good because the mosquito goes to nirvana more quickly. And I didn't call him up on it, but internally I was like, that doesn't sound right. Like you would never use that logic to say you should go around like killing people.
Osho kind of did. Like we talked about Osho in a recent episode too, and he basically made the argument that if a child is born and is like disabled, like is blind, or you think blindness isn't even really like the most serious disability you can possibly have, even though it's definitely a big challenge. But he was basically like, you kill the child and then the soul can be reincarnated in a healthy body. And I was like, whoa.
Yeah. Well, I've heard that. I mean, you also hear like Jim Jones used Christian doctrine and said like, it's okay. Like just put the children deserve peace. They just put them to sleep and they'll go to heaven, I think that like you can use almost any spiritual philosophy to justify murder. And that's why it's like, you have to, if you're getting into an ideology, particularly like a spiritual ideology or something that invokes God or like truth or these heavy ideas, you have to be able to like take a step back and be here in the now and think like, are these actually the effects that we want? Because you can use beautiful belief systems to justify horrible things. I do think that Eastern philosophy, though, in particular, like Zen Buddhism, and if you get into meditation and you're able to kind of go into your breath and detach from the here and now and recognize yourself as part of the flow of the universe, that's an extremely useful tool for being able to overcome any kind of fear, any kind of anxiety, any kind of anything. And it is, as he said, I could imagine that if you trained soldiers in Zen Buddhism, it would be a useful tool for getting them to be able to overcome their empathy and be able to kill somebody, because you can see, Žižek said, like, you see yourself as an actor in the dance of the universe, and like, oh, look at all these molecules and billions of years of flow coming together to drive my knife into your chest. Like, I can see how somebody could do that. But I don't think that that's a criticism of meditation or Zen philosophy so much as it's like, look at how these tools are powerful. Be careful.
Yeah, it makes me think also taking peyote. So peyote, of course, it can be a medicine. It can open your mind and help you see things and, shed your previous beliefs and get a whole new perspective. But traditionally, they did use it for battle. So you eat a couple of buttons and go into battle, and you start to, your eyes will get brighter and you'll see things more clearly. And you probably also go into some sort of rapture, like emotionally intense moments while you're beating the crap out of people.
Yeah, I almost saw that part as kind of like it definitely seemed like at least like an attack on sort of Eastern philosophy, or maybe put a different way, it seemed like kind of an attack on nihilism and maybe dissociating from yourself too much, which I think Peterson would totally agree with. And I think they both kind of agreed, like, yeah, it's dangerous to kind of detach from your own experience too much, and you should try to I don't know, like, build up the amount of meaning in your life so that you can stay connected to your experience.
Yeah, I think that this kind of goes back to how we talked about before. Like, if you detach and realize that you can do anything, you can say, I can do anything, or you can have somebody use it to say, oh, you can do anything. Like, you can do anything really depraved. But I don't think that the tool of detachment is necessarily bad. I think it's about how it's wielded.
Yeah, exactly. It's a tool, not a toy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of what Peterson, it seems like one antidote for some of these things could be like what Peterson was saying at the beginning, where like most ideas are wrong, and a truly sophisticated thinker will recognize that, will regard most of their ideas that way. So even if you're like really into Eastern philosophy and you're like, well, it's all the veil of Maya, and why don't I blah blah blah, if you're regarding your viewpoint with a little bit of like detachment, where you're like, well, it might not all be the veil of Maya, or like this baby might not reincarnate, so I shouldn't kill it or whatever. Like, it seems like that could be an antidote to some of the worst excesses of, because every ideology has its worst excesses or ways that you can take it in destructive ways. So.
Yeah, well, it's also, it's like if you take a single rule out of the philosophy and then you say, oh, okay, so I kill the child and it's going to be reincarnated. But hang on, that's not where it would end, not in Hinduism, not in Buddhism. Like, if you kill the child, you're responsible for that. That's your karma. So you can't just like shut that out and pretend that's not involved somehow, like if you end the life of a conscious being.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that's kind of where you get into the danger of like Peterson makes a distinction between religion and ideology, because he'll say like religion is these like large like superstructures that have evolved like through the millennia, and they're generally like they're archetypally rich, so they'll have looked at these things from multiple different perspectives. So you have all these like mechanisms to like, wait, there's a reason you don't kill the baby. There's a, like, even though it might seem like from this perspective you do. So it's like it catches all these things. Whereas like ideology, because we don't like, the modern person is like cynical about religion, like religion sucks, but instead we believe in ideologies, which are usually much newer, much shallower, much more one-sided. So you don't quite have the like if you just believe in reincarnation and maybe you've wiped away a lot of Hinduism and Buddhism, that's where it becomes dangerous. Ideologies are like, Peterson calls them parasitic on archetypes. So you take like one archetype, you build a whole big thing around it, but it's completely unbalanced.
I think that makes sense. I don't know. Like, do you think that you said that you felt vindicated when Žižek criticized this Zen Buddhism, like transformed into an ideology, maybe rather than a philosophy or a religion? Do you think that? Do you believe that Buddhism or Eastern philosophies are like particularly detrimental? Like, I think that any religion where you believe in an afterlife, you can use that belief in an afterlife to justify killing. Anything where you see like anything where you see yourself as like part of a dance in like this grand universal scheme, if you believe that God or the universe is on your side and that there's an afterlife for the victim, you can use that to justify it very easily. And that's basically any religion. And you see basically every religion justify war all the time.
I wouldn't necessarily like, I guess when I said I felt vindicated, I was kind of joking, but I was also referring to our Kaufman episode that we did a few weeks ago where I was kind of arguing that like viewing everything as an illusion or as a game and as like, or as life as like a canvas where without moral obligation was like a very dangerous position. And it seemed like Žižek was kind of arguing the same thing, but probably articulating it better than me. So I was feeling vindicated, I guess, a little bit, but I think to answer your question, like I don't think that like that perspective that Žižek was arguing against, or well, he was arguing against actual Zen Buddhism, but probably taken to a negative ideological imbalanced place. I think more the thing I was arguing against was maybe like you call it like neo-Buddhism or like neo-Taoism, which is like I think it kind of was like what I was referring to before is like when people take I think that they do it with people do it with Christianity too, but like less probably consciously of where it's coming from, where you reject the religion, you don't feel the need to study the religion. You feel above studying the religion, I guess, but you take certain elements of it. And, you know, when people talk about karma, but they don't know much about Hinduism, or when people will talk about, they'll take small elements of the religion without actually knowing what the context is. And then I think that's when things can be dangerous.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I do see how things could get hairy there. Like that probably applies to me pretty perfectly, but I don't know. I can see how it could get hairy. Like if you don't ground yourself and you take on some kind of a powerful spiritual belief and you don't ground it in a lot of context or in a lot of like skepticism, I think it can go very, very wrong. I did as soon as I saw that come up though, I started laughing and thinking, oh my God, this is exactly what Ariel was saying a couple of weeks ago. So that episode will be coming out on Monday. Tune in for that. I guess are we? I feel like it's been hard to cover this debate because the truth was it didn't really feel like much of an actual debate. Like do we?
Yeah, Žižek literally did not defend anything. He just said a bunch of stuff, a lot of which was sort of attacking, like part of it, half of which was attacking capitalism, the other half was just attacking his own position. So yeah, it definitely wasn't a debate. So
I don't want to say that what Žižek said wasn't without value, though. It's just like a lot of little tiny nuggets about a lot of topics. So it's difficult to put together a position out of it. But I would say that you'd get value out of watching the debate or reading Žižek in general.
Yeah, I'd really like them to talk again. Like, I think one thing I found really heartening about watching the debate is it seemed like I had the impression that they came into the debate with a lot of misconceptions about each other's opinions, like Jordan Peterson pretty obviously so in his opening statements, but Žižek as well. Like we didn't get a chance to talk about this very much, but the whole like neo-Marxist conspiracy theory thing, like I feel like it's a total misrepresentation of Peterson's position, and Žižek asked him about it, and I felt that a lot of the debate was just them coming to understand each other better, which I think was a pretty it was heartening to watch. I found it like kind of heartwarming.
Yeah, and the end of the debate, it definitely ended on like a really positive note, where actually the only time where I could follow what Žižek was saying was at the very end when they asked both of them, what's the one takeaway that you want, people to have from this debate, where Žižek basically said, if you're a liberal, don't be afraid to be politically correct, or don't feel the need to be politically correct, I think is what he said. And I was like, wow, he was totally coherent, and that was a great point. And then they kind of Peterson said something like, what Ariel just said, which is, I want the world to see that even people who appear to have completely opposite worldviews actually could have a lot of common ground and end up coming together. So I thought that was a very positive note to end on.
They should start a podcast together.
Oh, that would be fantastic.
No, they should just come on our podcast.
Come on our podcast. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a great place to end, everyone. Thank you to all of our panelists. This was a lot of fun. Thank you to everyone who's watching on Facebook, who has watched. We really appreciate your interest in these topics. Please, check out our Facebook. We have a YouTube. We have an Instagram. We're going to have all kinds of other stuff very soon. Like, subscribe if you want to hear more of our content. We talk about this stuff all the time. This has been great.
Happy 420, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan, for taking on Zizek's position, for doing what Zizek could not do.
Yes, thank you, Dan.
Yes, thank you very much.
I gave it a shot. I'll try to figure out how to be more clear and succinct in the future. Appreciate the conversation, guys.
Take care, everyone.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.